Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're diving deep into George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant. It explores how framing shapes our political thinking. You ever notice how certain words or phrases just hit you a certain way? Even if you don't agree with the message itself. That's the power of framing, tapping into those pre-existing ideas and emotions we all have.
It's wild how Lakoff shows it's not just about the facts, it's about how those facts are presented. He argues that conservatives have been incredibly successful at framing. They make their ideas resonate with people on a gut level.
Like with that example he gives tax relief. Just those two words make taxes sound like a burden, and anyone promising to reduce them becomes a hero. And it's so subtle that even people who oppose the idea can end up reinforcing it without realizing it.
Exactly. Lakoff argues that's a big reason why progressive messages sometimes fall flat. They get caught up refuting conservative talking points, which just strengthens those frames.
So what's the solution? How can progressives get their message across better?
Lakoff argues that all politics is moral at its core. Every stance comes from a moral framework. He uses this idea of two competing family models, the strict father and the nurturant parent. Think about it. So many political debates are about how society should function, almost like how a family should be run.
Okay, so break down these models for me.
The strict father is all about discipline, self-reliance, and a hierarchical structure. Father's the ultimate authority. Obedience is key. It's this worldview that the world's dangerous, and you need discipline and strength to succeed. This shapes conservative views on everything, from social programs to foreign policy.
So things like social safety nets would be seen as coddling, like rewarding weakness. And a strong military is essential to protect against threats, both foreign and domestic.
Exactly. Then you have the nurturant parent model. It's all about empathy, responsibility for yourself and others, a world where everyone has the opportunity to fulfill their potential, much more collaborative, supportive worldview, where everyone's well-being is valued.
So in this model, social programs are investments, a way to help everyone thrive. Diplomacy and cooperation are favored over military might.
Precisely. And Lakoff argues that understanding these models is crucial to understanding why some arguments resonate and others don't.
So how did these models connect back to framing? How can progressives use this to be more persuasive?
That's where this concept of hypocognition comes in. It's basically lacking the specific language or frames. To understand and articulate a complex idea, Lakoff says progressives struggle with this because they haven't developed accessible frames for their values. They're playing catch-up, trying to negate conservative frames instead of establishing their own.
So if conservatives have framed taxes as this burden needing relief, how can progressives reframe that conversation?
Lakoff uses the example of reframing taxes as an investment. Instead of focusing on what you're giving up, you highlight the benefits that come from taxes. Schools, roads, healthcare, things that make society function. It shifts the focus from individual burden to collective good.
That makes sense. It's about tapping into those deeper values, those shared aspirations that connect us.
Exactly. It's about speaking to people's hearts as well as their minds.
So it's not enough to just have the facts. You need to frame them in a way that resonates with values and emotions.
And Lakoff argues this isn't about manipulating people. It's about understanding how our brains work and using that knowledge to communicate better.
So framing's a tool that can be used for good or bad, depending on the intention behind it.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the power of language and using it responsibly.
Let's dig into this idea of framing in action a bit more. I know Lakoff talks about systemic causation as being crucial to understand, especially with issues like climate change.
Yes, systemic causation is the idea that events are often caused by a complex network of interconnected factors, not just a single direct cause. Like with global warming, it's not just one thing. It's a whole system of factors, from deforestation to industrial emissions.
And if we don't understand that, we risk oversimplifying the issue and coming up with solutions that don't actually work.
Exactly. Lakoff argues that neglecting this framework leads to misleading metaphors and inaccurate public discourse. He's critical of metaphors like playing dice with climate change because it makes it sound like some game of chance. Instead, he suggests using metaphors that reflect the complexity, like global warming heats the oceans.
So it's about choosing language that reflects the reality, not just trying to be catchy or clever.
Right. It's about being responsible with our language, especially when dealing with issues that have huge consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the power of framing, the importance of understanding our moral frameworks, and the need to recognize systemic causation. Where do we go from here? How can we as individuals start applying these ideas?
That's a great question, and I think it's the perfect place to pause for now. When we come back, we'll explore some of Lakoff's practical advice and how we can all become more effective communicators and advocates for the causes we care about.
So we've established framing matters, and it's tied to these deeply held values, often expressed through metaphors like strict father and nurturant parent. But just knowing that doesn't make us master communicators. What does Lakoff suggest we actually do with this knowledge?
Well, he gets into how these models shape our understanding of even seemingly unrelated issues. Take environmental protection, for example. A strict father approach might emphasize individual responsibility. You pollute, you clean up. Whereas a nurturant parent view sees it as a collective issue, requiring cooperation and care for the shared environment.
It's like two totally different lenses, and the solutions we come up with will be totally different too.
Exactly. And Lakoff argues progressives need to be more aware of these underlying frames, not just to understand the other side, but to articulate their own values more clearly.
So it's about consciously choosing the language. That reflects our values and the world we want.
He gives this example of reframing pensions. Instead of letting them be framed as handouts, which they often are by those favoring a strict father model, he suggests reframing them as delayed payment for work already done.
That changes things completely, from dependence on the government to earn benefits.
It reclaims the narrative and speaks to a sense of fairness and respect for those who have contributed to society. And this applies to so many other issues. Lakoff argues that progressives need to be more proactive in framing their arguments, not just reacting to what conservatives put out there.
So it's not enough to point out flaws in their arguments. We need to offer a compelling alternative, framed in a way that resonates.
Precisely. He suggests actively building new frames, new ways of understanding issues that align with progressive values. Remember, we talked about hypocognition earlier. If progressives lack the language to express their ideas, they'll always be on the defensive.
Like we're trying to translate our ideas into a language that doesn't fit, while conservatives are speaking their native tongue.
That's a great analogy. And that's why Lakoff stresses building our own conceptual toolbox, filled with frames that make our arguments persuasive and memorable. And he highlights another area where framings had a huge impact, the way we think about corporations. That phrase, corporations are people, for example.
Yeah, that's become so ingrained we don't even question it anymore.
And Lakoff argues this seemingly harmless metaphor has actually had disastrous consequences. It's allowed corporations to claim the same rights as individuals, often at the expense of the public good.
So they've gone from entities meant to serve the public to these behemoths with rights but not many responsibilities.
Exactly. And Lakoff traces this back to court decisions, each one building on the last. That gradually expanded the rights of corporations.
Classic systemic causation in action. Small changes leading to a huge power shift.
And as they've gained power, they've gained influence over our political system, too, further solidifying their position. Lakoff argues this unchecked corporate power has contributed to rising inequality, environmental degradation, a whole host of problems.
Like, we've created a system where profit comes before anything else, even people and the planet.
And Lakoff is clear, this isn't just an economic issue, it's a moral one. He argues we need to challenge this frame and create a new narrative, one that puts people and the planet above corporate profits.
But how do we even start? It feels so daunting going up against this massive system.
It's a challenge for sure. But Lakoff says it's one we can't ignore. The stakes are too high, especially with things like climate change and inequality.
So what are some actual steps we can take? How can we be more than just passive consumers of these narratives?
Lakoff really emphasizes being mindful of the language we use, choosing words and phrases that reflect our values, that promote the kind of world we want. For example, instead of cutting taxes, which reinforces this idea that taxes are bad, we can talk about investing in our communities or ensuring everyone pays their fair share.
It's reframing the conversation.
Yeah.
Shifting from individual burden to collective good.
Exactly. And it's about being persistent. We need to consistently challenge those dominant frames, offer alternative narratives. Lakoff encourages progressives to engage in public discourse, write letters, call representatives, talk to friends and family.
Be the change we want to see, not just in our minds, but in how we interact with the world.
And understand this is a long-term project. Changing deeply ingrained ideas takes time and effort. But Lakoff argues it's essential if we want a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
It can feel kind of overwhelming, though, right? Like, where do you even begin to shift how a whole society thinks about something so ingrained, like this whole idea of corporate power?
Oh, it's a huge challenge, no doubt. But Lakoff's point is we can't ignore it. The stakes are just too high, especially with these urgent issues we face, like climate change, economic inequality, all of that.
So what can we actually do? How can we be more than just passive consumers of these narratives?
Well, Lakoff keeps coming back to this idea of being mindful, mindful of the language we use, choosing words that reflect our values, words that promote the world we want to see. Like instead of saying cutting taxes, which makes it sound like taxes are inherently bad, we can say investing in our communities or ensuring everyone pays their fair share.
There's that reframing thing again, shifting from burden to good.
Exactly. And it's about being persistent, too. We can't just do this once. We got to consistently challenge those old frames, offer up these alternative ways of thinking. Lakoff really encourages progressives to get out there, engage in public discourse, write letters, call representatives, even just talk to your friends and family about this stuff.
Walking the walk, talking the talk.
Exactly. And knowing this is a marathon, not a sprint, changing deeply ingrained ideas takes serious time and effort. But Lakoff's argument is that it's absolutely essential if we want to build a more just world, a more equitable world, a more sustainable world, all of it.
So at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway from Don't Think of an Elephant?
It's a call to action, plain and simple, especially for progressives. It's this reminder that language has power, and we have a responsibility to use that power wisely by understanding framing, by crafting our own narratives, by pushing back against those harmful frames we see everywhere. That's how we can start to shift the conversation and open up space for real progressive change.
It was empowering, in a way. Knowing we're not just bystanders, we can actually shape the conversation, influence how people think, and ultimately help create the world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Lakoff leaves you with this sense of hope, this belief that change is possible, but we have to be active participants, not passive ones. It's about taking back the power of language and using it to build a better future.
This deep dive into framing and how it shapes politics has been incredible. If you're ready to really dig into this stuff, give yourself the tools to be a better communicator, a better advocate. We highly recommend checking out Don't Think of an Elephant. It's a real eye-opener. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives like this. You can even grab a copy of the book using the link below. Your support helps us keep making this content. Thanks for joining us on Mindful Moments, and we'll catch you in the next episode.